Fame nearly killed George Harrison. The world saw him as the quiet Beatle, but behind the scenes, his battles with fame, heartbreak, and even death itself were anything but quiet. Yet, against all odds, he found peace, and today, Backstage Melody takes you inside that journey. George Harrison's story began in a small working-class home on Arnold Grove in Liverpool, England. Born on February 25, 1943, George was the youngest of 4 children to Harold and Louise Harrison. His father worked as a bus conductor, while his mother ran the household with warmth and music always in the background. Unlike the polished image of the superstar he would later become, George grew up as an ordinary boy who spent his days riding his bike around Liverpool and listening to early rock and roll records that would change his life forever. By his early teens, George was already fascinated by the guitar. He would sit for hours trying to replicate the riffs he heard from artists like Elvis Presley and Perkins. He didn't have formal training. His determination and ear for music were his teachers. It was during this time that fate intervened. A school friend, Paul McCartney, introduced George to a young John Lennon who was already forming a small skiffle group called the Quarrymen. Lennon thought George was too young at first, but after hearing him play a few chords perfectly on the spot, he knew this quiet, serious teenager had something special. Within just a few years, the band evolved into the Beatles. By the early 1960s, George went from practicing in cramped Liverpool rooms to playing sold-out shows around the world. Beatlemania swept across continents like a storm. Fans screamed, cried, and fainted at every performance. But for George, this instant superstardom wasn't all glamour. He often felt trapped, struggling to find his voice in a band dominated by Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership. Despite being one of the most famous people alive by age 20, George described the experience as suffocating. "We were just normal lads," he said, "and suddenly, we were in this whirlpool where everyone wanted a piece of us." The pressure was relentless, and it set the stage for the spiritual journey that would change him forever. By 1965, at the height of Beatlemania, George Harrison began to realize that fame and fortune were hollow trophies. While millions of fans screamed his name, George felt a strange emptiness. He was living every musician's dream, yet he found himself asking, "Is this all there is?" Unlike John and Paul, who reveled in the creative chaos of fame, George craved meaning and a deeper connection to life beyond the flashing cameras and endless recording sessions. The turning point came when George stumbled upon the sound of the sitar during the filming of Help. The instrument's hypnotic tone struck something deep inside him, as though it was speaking a truth he hadn't heard before. Soon after, George sought out Ravi Shankar, the world-renowned sitar virtuoso, who would not only teach him the instrument, but also open the door to a new world of spiritual exploration. Under Shankar's mentorship, George dove into Indian classical music, yoga, and Hindu philosophy. He became fascinated with the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita and the practice of meditation, which gave him a calm he had never known before. "The whole purpose of life," George once said, "is to find God, that's all." This spiritual path became his lifeline, an escape from the suffocating world of fame. However, this inner journey wasn't without its challenges. George's growing interest in spirituality often clashed with the Beatles' high-octane lifestyle of parties, drugs, and constant touring. While his bandmates were experimenting with psychedelic substances to find inspiration, George was seeking something purer, something that didn't fade when the high wore off. His exploration of Indian culture led to some of the Beatles' most iconic and experimental tracks, including Norwegian Wood, where he famously introduced the sitar to mainstream pop music. Yet, while his creativity flourished, George still struggled to have his songs featured alongside the Lennon-McCartney machine. This tension within the band only pushed him further into seeking solace outside of fame, laying the foundation for the spiritual themes that would dominate his solo career. Solo struggles and creative breakthrough. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, George Harrison finally had the creative freedom he had long craved. For years, he'd been quietly building a library of songs that often went unheard, overshadowed by the dominance of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. While his songwriting contributions like Something and Here Comes the Sun had become instant classics, George often felt like the third wheel in the band's creative process. The split, although painful, opened the door for him to step out of their shadow, and what he did next shocked the world. In November 1970, George released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that revealed just how much he'd been holding back. It wasn't just an album, it was a statement of artistic independence. Tracks like My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity showcased his deep spirituality and emotional depth. My Sweet Lord, with its mix of gospel influences and Hare Krishna chants, became the first solo Beatles single to hit #1, proving that George was every bit as powerful a songwriter as Lennon or McCartney. Critics praised the album's lush production, courtesy of Phil Spector, and its ambitious scope. Fans connected with its themes of impermanence, love, and spiritual longing, ideas that George had been quietly nurturing during his time with the Beatles. Yet, despite the success, George wasn't driven by fame or accolades. He saw All Things Must Pass as a cathartic release of the creative energy he'd been bottling up for years. However, the sudden spotlight on him as a solo artist brought its own challenges. George was never comfortable with being the center of attention, and the intense media focus on his personal life, particularly his marriage to Pattie Boyd, began to weigh heavily on him. He also faced legal battles over My Sweet Lord, which was accused of plagiarizing the chiffon's He's So Fine. Though the case dragged on for years, George maintained that the similarity was unintentional. Despite these struggles, George pushed forward, organizing the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, one of the first major benefit concerts in history. The event, featuring legends like Eric Clapton and Bob Dylan, raised millions for refugees of the Bangladesh Liberation War. It was a groundbreaking moment that not only solidified George's place as a humanitarian, but also demonstrated that his fame could be used for something far greater than himself. But the 1970s would also test George in ways he never expected. After the triumph of All Things Must Pass and the historic success of the Concert for Bangladesh, George Harrison was riding high both creatively and spiritually. But by the mid-1970s, cracks began to appear. Fame, once again, was taking a toll on him. Only this time, it was mixed with personal heartbreak, intense scrutiny, and a demanding schedule that left little room for peace. The trouble began during the recording of his 1974 album, Dark Horse. George was going through one of the most turbulent times of his life. His marriage to Pattie Boyd, which had been deteriorating for years, finally crumbled when she left him for his close friend Eric Clapton. The love triangle became a tabloid frenzy, and George's usually reserved personal life was suddenly splashed across headlines. He often tried to downplay the scandal, but privately, it was devastating. As he poured his emotions into Dark Horse, George was also dealing with an exhausting tour schedule. Determined to prove himself as a solo artist on stage, he embarked on a U.S. tour in late 1974, his first as a solo performer. Unfortunately, his voice was not ready for the grueling demands. Years of heavy smoking, combined with stress and strain, left his vocals hoarse and raspy. Critics pounced, describing his performances as subpar and unfocused, while fans expecting Beatles classics were often disappointed by his new, experimental set lists. Rumors began to swirl about George's lifestyle during this period. Whispers of heavy cocaine use and excessive drinking circulated among music insiders and the press, painting a picture of a man battling inner demons. While George rarely addressed these rumors directly, his close friends admitted that he was under intense emotional strain and had fallen into unhealthy habits. The backlash was harsh. The press, which once hailed him as the most spiritual Beatle, now portrayed him as a fallen idol. Even Dark Horse, with its heartfelt lyrics and funky, unconventional sound, was met with mixed reviews. George himself later admitted that the period was one of his lowest points, both personally and professionally. Yet, even in the darkest moments, there were glimpses of resilience. "It's all karma," George said in an interview, reflecting on the chaotic mid-70s. "You go through bad times to get to the good ones." And George's next chapter would prove just how true that was. By the late 1980s, George Harrison had stepped back from the relentless grind of the music industry. While he occasionally released solo projects and worked with friends like Tom Petty and Bob Dylan in the Traveling Wilburys, he preferred a quieter life, dedicating more time to family, gardening, and spiritual practices. But the peace he had fought so hard to find was soon tested in ways that would shake him to his core. In 1997, George was diagnosed with oral cancer, a result of decades of heavy cigarette smoking. The news came as a devastating blow, not only to George but to fans around the world who still saw him as the youthful, quiet Beatle. He underwent aggressive surgery and radiation treatments to remove the tumors, and although the treatment was successful at first, it left him frail and weakened. Despite the pain, George maintained a stoic attitude. "I'm not scared of dying," he once said. "Death is just where your suit falls off and your spirit continues." His calm acceptance reflected a lifetime of spiritual preparation. But the illness was a stark reminder that fame and fortune couldn't shield him from life's ultimate challenges. Just as he was beginning to recover, another tragedy struck. On the night of December 30th, 1999, a mentally unstable man broke into George's home, Friar Park, armed with a knife. In a horrifying attack, the intruder stabbed George over 40 times, puncturing his lung and leaving him fighting for his life. His wife, Olivia Harrison, managed to fend off the attacker with a heavy lamp, saving George's life in the process. George later said that during the attack, he silently repeated the mantra, Hare Krishna, as a way to focus his mind and keep calm. This spiritual practice, which had guided him for decades, became his lifeline in that terrifying moment. Although he survived, the assault left both physical and emotional scars. Many of his friends believed the trauma of the attack weakened his immune system, hastening the return of cancer just a couple of years later. By 2001, the cancer had spread to his lungs and brain. Rather than undergo endless treatments, George chose to spend his final months in peace, surrounded by loved ones, meditating, and preparing for the next phase of existence. In his final years, George Harrison embraced the quiet life he had always dreamed of. After decades of chaos, fame, and personal turmoil, he found solace in the simple rhythms of everyday life. His sprawling estate, Friar Park, became more than just a home. It was his sanctuary. George spent countless hours gardening, tending to the intricate landscapes himself, finding a sense of peace in watching the natural world grow and thrive. He once said, "Gardening is like music. It's an expression of your soul. The garden doesn't ask for fame or money. It only asks for love and patience." Although he stepped away from the spotlight, George's creative spirit never died. He continued to write and record music privately, often inviting close friends like Eric Clapton, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne over for casual jam sessions. These moments weren't about chart success or public acclaim. They were about connection, friendship, and joy. His work with the Traveling Wilburys in the late 80s and early 90s gave him a renewed sense of fun and camaraderie, proving that his love for music remained pure even when the industry pressures had faded. George was equally passionate about his charitable efforts. Through his Material World Charitable Foundation, which he established in 1973, he donated millions to humanitarian causes, including disaster relief, education, and cultural preservation. His concert for Bangladesh in 1971 had already set a precedent for charity-driven music events, and George continued to quietly fund projects that aligned with his values. Unlike many celebrities, he didn't chase publicity for his philanthropy. He gave because he genuinely cared. Spiritually, George became even more devoted to his Krishna consciousness, meditation, and reading sacred texts. Those close to him say that, despite his declining health, he radiated a sense of calm and acceptance. When cancer returned in 2001, spreading to his lungs and brain, George chose to face it on his own terms. He spent his final months with his family, especially his beloved son, Thani, preparing himself mentally and spiritually for the journey beyond this life. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away at the age of 58, but his legacy continues to grow. His songs, from Here Comes the Sun to My Sweet Lord, still resonate with millions. More than just a musician, George left behind a blueprint for living authentically, prioritizing peace, purpose, and love over fame and fortune. George Harrison's life was proof that fame can take everything from you if you let it. Yet, despite the chaos, he found peace by looking inward and embracing a higher purpose. He showed us that true success isn't about being the loudest or the most celebrated. It's about living in harmony with yourself. What do you think was George's most powerful message to the world? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Backstage Melody for more untold stories of music legends.